The chamber was already arguing when I walked in, and nobody noticed me at all. That was fine. I preferred it that way. 812 species were represented in the Grand Hall of the Galactic Council that morning. The seats curved upward in a great arc, tier after tier, each filled with delegates in their finest colors, their translator beads glowing soft gold at their throats. The air smelled of 36 different atmospheres being pumped in through individual vents, and the noise was extraordinary, not the controlled noise of debate, but the sharp, anxious noise of confusion. Something had already happened before I arrived. I could feel it in the way the Vorathi delegates were leaning toward each other, their gray neck frills fanning wide. I could feel it in the way the Olden sat perfectly still, which was what Olden did when they were frightened. I set my box down on the table in front of the human seat. It was not a large box. It held a framed photograph of my daughter, a spare translator bead, 3 pens, and a small plant that my wife had given me when I first took this post 11 years ago. The plant had outlasted 2 council chairs, 1 galactic recession, and a border war that had technically never been declared. I liked that plant. I sat down and folded my hands on the table. Delegate Oren of the Olden, who sat nearest to me, turned and looked at the box. Then he looked at me. His wide, pale eyes blinked twice in rapid succession, which for an Olden meant something between deep concern and mild panic. "Ambassador Marin," he said carefully, "why have you brought a box?" "I am collecting my things," I told him. He stared at me for a moment. "Are you ill?" "No." "Are you being removed from your post?" "No." "Then why?" "Because I am leaving," I said. "And when I leave, I would like to take my things with me." The council chair, a Vorathi named Archon Veldros, who had held the position for 60 years and had the look of a man who believed he would hold it for 60 more, called the chamber to order at that moment, and Oren had to turn away. I was grateful. I did not want to explain everything twice. Veldros spread his 4-fingered hands wide and let his voice carry through the translators. He was a skilled speaker. I had watched him silence rooms that contained beings who could shatter stone with their voices. "This session has been called," he announced, "to address an irregularity that was discovered in the Council's administrative records this morning." He paused. Every delegate in the room was now completely still. "It appears that the human delegation filed a formal document 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days ago through the standard administrative submission portal. This document appears to be—" He stopped. He looked down at the paper in front of him. He looked up again. "It appears to be a notice of withdrawal from the Galactic Council." The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then the room broke wide open. I sat with my hands folded and waited. They argued for 20 minutes before anyone thought to ask me anything. That was also fine. I used the time to look around the chamber one last time. I had spent 11 years in this room. I had watched humanity be mocked here, delayed here, dismissed here, and occasionally, rarely, heard here. I had watched junior delegates from species that had been in the council for 1,000 years speak over me mid-sentence. I had watched our proposals get tabled, buried, and quietly forgotten. I had watched the Vorathi, who ran the administrative committees, stamp "pending review" on a human application for basic colony resource rights, and then leave it pending for 6 years. 6 years. The plant on the table in front of me had grown 4 new leaves in that time. I had counted. Archon Veldros finally raised his hand for silence and turned to me. He was composed. He was always composed. It was one of the things I genuinely respected about him, and I respected very little about this institution. "Ambassador Marin," he said, "perhaps you can explain this document." "It is a notice of withdrawal," I said. "The explanation is in the title. You cannot simply withdraw from the Galactic Council." "The Charter disagrees with you," I said. "Article 44, subsection 9, clause 3. Any member species may voluntarily withdraw upon submitting a formal notice through the standard administrative portal, with a minimum processing period of 3 years. I paused. Our processing period ended 11 days ago. The withdrawal is already complete. The silence this time was different. It was the silence of 812 species doing mental arithmetic and arriving at an answer they did not like. Veldros was very still. "You filed this 3 years ago." 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days ago, I agreed, "as your own records show." And you said nothing. The charter does not require us to announce it. It requires us to file it. We filed it. Why did you not? He stopped, restarted. Why were we not informed? I looked at him for a moment. I thought about 6 years of a pending stamp. I thought about my predecessor, Ambassador Claire Hobbs, who had died in this chamber, not dramatically, not from anything other than age and exhaustion, still waiting for the Council to ratify a basic humanitarian agreement for the 3 human colonies in the Outer Belt. She had waited 19 years. The ratification came 8 months after her death. I had attended the vote. Nobody else mentioned her name. With respect, Archon, I said, we submitted the document through the standard administrative portal, the same portal through which the Council receives all formal submissions from member species. We followed every procedure correctly. If the document sat unread for 3 years, that is not our failing. The room erupted again. I led it. Delegate Shal Urin, of the Rendaki, who had always been the loudest voice against any human proposal, stood from his seat and pointed directly at me. His color had gone from his species' natural deep blue to something approaching violet, which for a Rendaki meant rage. This is a provocation, he announced, a deliberate act of aggression against the Council. We filed a piece of administrative paperwork, I said, through the correct channel, at the correct time, using the correct form. You hid it. We submitted it, I said. There is a difference. One requires deception, the other requires a filing code and a working administrative portal. The Council will not recognize this withdrawal, Veldros said. His voice was controlled, but I had known him for 11 years. I could hear the current running under it. I opened the folder I had placed on the table beside my box. I slid a single sheet of paper toward the center of the table, where the Council's official recorder, a small, precise being named Fen, who had been recording Council proceedings for 40 years, and who I genuinely liked, could take it. That is a copy of the filing receipt, I said, time-stamped, digitally verified, and countersigned by the Council's own administrative system. The withdrawal is already a matter of official record. This session is not a negotiation. I came today to collect my belongings and to inform you in person, as a courtesy. A courtesy, Veldros repeated. His voice had gone very quiet. That was new. I had never heard him go quiet before. Yes, I said. I stood. I picked up my box. I tucked the small plant under my arm. Oren reached out and touched my sleeve very gently. Kale, he said. He did not use my title. We had known each other a long time. Where will you go? I looked at him. He was genuinely worried. Not for the Council, I thought. For me. Or perhaps for both of us. Home, I said. I walked out of the grand hall of the Galactic Council for the last time. Behind me, I could hear the chamber collapsing into the loudest, most disorganized argument I had ever heard come out of that room. It was, in its own way, the most human thing that had ever happened there. My shuttle was waiting at Dock 7. My pilot, a young man named Gareth Cole who was 26 years old and had never been nervous about anything in his life, was leaning against the hull eating a sandwich. He saw my expression and straightened up. Good meeting? Historic, I said. He took another bite of his sandwich. You want to talk about it? Not yet. He nodded and climbed into the cockpit. I strapped in, put my box on the seat beside me, and checked that the plant had not lost any soil during the walk. It had not. The plant was, as always, doing fine. We cleared the station and pointed toward the heliopause, toward the invisible line where human space began and the Council's influence ended. Through the rear viewport, the Council's great station grew smaller, its lights still brilliant against the dark, its chambers still shouting. I watched until I could not see it anymore. Then I faced forward. Gareth glanced at me from the pilot's seat. You want music? Yes, I said, something quiet. He put on something quiet. We flew through the dark, and 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days of waiting finally ended, and something else, something much larger and much stranger, quietly began. I spent a lot of time on that shuttle thinking about a morning 11 years earlier, when I had been standing in a corridor outside a Council administrative office with a briefcase in my hand, and a very clear memory of what my wife had said to me before I left Earth. She She had said, "Don't let them make you small." Her name was Caroline, and she said things like that very simply, without drama, as though she were reminding me to take a coat. She was a structural engineer who had spent 9 years building atmospheric processors on the second Martian colony, and she had a way of looking at complicated problems and describing them in the plainest possible language until they became manageable. I had told her, that morning, that I was nervous. I had told her that the Council was 800 years old, and that humanity had been a member for less than 40 years, and that I did not know if anything I said in those chambers would matter at all. She had kissed me goodbye and said, "Don't let them make you small." I thought about that a great deal during those 11 years. The Council had a long tradition of making younger species feel small. It was not intentional. Not exactly. It was simply the result of 800 years of the same species, making the same decisions, in the same room, with the same assumptions baked into every procedure, every vote, every informal understanding about how things worked. When humanity was admitted to the Council, we were given what was called the observation tier, non-voting, advisory status only. The official rationale was that new species needed time to acclimate to the pace and complexity of galactic governance. The unofficial rationale, which I understood within my first month, was that the older species were not yet sure what to make of us, and what they did not understand, they preferred to keep where they could watch it. We spent 6 years in the observation tier. 6 years of sitting in a separate section of the chamber, behind a low rail that was not quite a barrier but functioned as one, watching debates we could not participate in, raising our hands at designated points for advisory input that was logged and almost never discussed. 6 years of being referred to in Council documents as the human observers, rather than delegates. 6 years of submitting proposals through a separate filing system, not the standard portal, a different one, with longer processing times and an additional review stage that the other species did not have. 6 years of smiling and being patient and writing careful, thorough, well-documented applications and watching them go into the review process and come back stamped with language like "further study required" and "timeline to be determined." I was not the ambassador during those 6 years. My predecessor, Claire Hobbs, was. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman with white hair and an extraordinary memory, and she had more patience than anyone I have ever known. She used to say that patience was not the absence of feeling. It was the decision to direct your energy toward what you could change instead of what you could not. She directed a great deal of energy toward the colonies in the outer belt, where 300,000 humans were living in habitats that had been built for temporary occupation and had become permanent through necessity. She filed application after application for resource access rights, for infrastructure support, for basic humanitarian classifications that would have unlocked Council aid programs. She filed them carefully and correctly and persistently, and they were reviewed and delayed and reviewed again, and the people in those colonies continued living in habitats built for temporary occupation. What the Council did not know, what I was careful to make sure they did not know, during my own 11 years, was what was happening while they delayed. Humanity does not wait well. This is something that gets described as a flaw, both by other species and sometimes by ourselves. We are impatient. We are restless. We do not sit comfortably with a problem that could theoretically be solved right now but is not being solved because the relevant committee has not yet convened. We understand why committees exist. We simply cannot stop ourselves from also trying to solve the problem while the committee is convening, just in case the committee takes a while. The Council took a while. We used the time. The first thing we did was the mapping. The Council's official star charts covered approximately 60% of the galaxy's accessible regions, and the coverage became increasingly thin toward the outer arms. This was not a secret. The Council acknowledged the gaps and had various long-term programs in place to address them, none of which were moving quickly. Human cartographers, which meant, primarily, a distributed network of survey ships operated by university departments, private companies, and individual enthusiasts with more ambition than common sense, had been conducting their own mapping for decades. By the time I took over from Claire Hobbs, we had quietly accumulated navigation data covering 43,000 systems that did not appear in any official Council registry. Not military data, navigation data, jump coordinates, gravitational maps, atmospheric surveys, the kind of information that made travel possible. We had not shared it with the Council. They had not asked. The second thing was the trade. The Council's formal trade networks ran along established routes between established members, with tariffs and agreements and regulatory frameworks that had been negotiated over centuries. They were stable and they were known and they were, in many places, deeply inefficient. Humans had a different approach to trade, which was roughly, go find someone who has something you want, find out what they want that you have, and work something out. This approach had served us reasonably well on Earth for several thousand years, and it served us reasonably well in space. The outer systems, the fringe, in Council terminology, were full of species that the Council had either never contacted or had assessed as too small, too poor, or too complicated for formal membership. Some of them had been formally denied membership. Some had never applied. Some did not know the Council existed, or knew and had decided they were better off without the complication. Human merchants had been trading with fringe species since before I was born, not officially, not through Council channels, just through the ordinary human process of showing up somewhere new, with something to offer, and finding out if anyone was interested. By the time I filed the withdrawal notice, human commercial relationships with fringe species numbered in the hundreds. Not trade agreements in the Council sense, no formal treaties, no regulatory frameworks, just relationships. Ongoing, informal, mutually beneficial, and completely outside the Council's visibility because the Council had never thought to look for them. The third thing was the infrastructure. This one, I will admit, we were more deliberate about. The Council monitored human activity, but their monitoring was primarily focused on political and military indicators. They watched our diplomacy. They watched our fleet deployments. They watched our major construction projects, the ones that were big enough to appear on standard long-range sensors. What they did not watch, because it had not occurred to them to watch it, was our software. Everything in the Council ran on software. Navigation, communication, administrative processing, resource allocation, legal arbitration. All of it, across 800 species, ran on a vast interlocking web of systems that had been built up over centuries, layer by layer, until the original architecture was buried so deep that nobody remembered exactly what it was or how it worked. The Council had IT divisions, of course, large ones, but the maintenance of the actual functioning systems had, over time, been increasingly contracted out to whoever could do it most efficiently. Humans are very good at software. We had been doing it for a long time before we reached space, and we kept doing it after. By the time I walked into the Council chamber for my last session, the administrative software running 41% of the Council's internal systems had been written, maintained, and updated by human contractors. The navigation assistance tools used by 60% of registered Council shipping had been developed by a human company based in Edinburgh. The legal arbitration algorithm that had quietly resolved 9 border disputes over the past decade without any of them escalating to Council debate had been built by a team at the University of Lagos as a graduate research project. None of this was secret. All of it was simply unremarkable, the way the background of a painting is unremarkable. You look at the painting. You do not think about the canvas. I had been very patient about that canvas for 11 years. On the shuttle home, I opened my briefcase and took out the file I had been keeping since my second year as ambassador. It was a detailed record: names, dates, systems, companies, relationships, contract values, integration depths. Every thread that connected human work to galactic infrastructure. Every place where, if that thread were pulled, something somewhere would stop working correctly. I did not intend to pull any of them. That was not the point. The point was that they existed, and that the Council had been so accustomed to thinking of humanity as the small, new, impatient species in the observation tier that they had never noticed how deeply we had rooted ourselves into the actual functioning of the galaxy while they were busy keeping us out of the formal decision-making. Claire Hobbs had died waiting for a vote that didn't matter. The vote hadn't mattered because we had spent 19 years making the vote irrelevant. Gareth's voice came through the intercom. "Ambassador, we're crossing the heliopause in about 10 minutes. "Thank you, Gareth." I closed the file. I looked out the window at the space between stars, which was very dark and very full of things the Council had not yet catalogued. I thought about Caroline. I thought about what she had said. Don't let them make you small. We hadn't. We had just been very quiet about it. My communicator buzzed twice before we crossed the heliopause. The first message was from the Vorathi diplomatic office, requesting an urgent meeting. I marked it as received and did not respond. The second was from Delegate Oren of the Olden, personal code, not official channels. It said only, "I hope you know what you're doing, Kale." I typed back, "Say hello to your family from mine." He would understand that, or he would not. Either way, it was the most honest thing I could say. We crossed the heliopause. My communicator fell quiet for exactly 3 minutes, which was how long the signal took to reroute through human relay systems instead of council ones. Then it lit up so completely that I had to turn the screen face down on the seat beside me and look out the window instead. The stars on this side of the line looked the same as the stars on the other side. They always do. Lines drawn by politics do not change the light. But I knew, in the way you know things that you have been working toward for a very long time, that something had shifted. Not dramatically. Not with fire or noise or the clash of anything large and obvious. Just quietly, the way the important things shift. The Council had been the center of galactic governance for 800 years. It had been the frame through which every species understood their place in the larger picture. And humanity, the newest and smallest and most mocked member, had spent 40 years inside that frame, being patient and being quiet and being overlooked, while steadily, carefully, and without a single announcement, we had built an entirely different picture around the outside of it. They were going to look up soon and notice the frame was gone. I hoped they would be all right when they did. I genuinely did. But I had also spent 11 years watching the Council respond to things it had not anticipated, and I was not, if I was being honest with myself, particularly optimistic. Gareth reduced thrust for the approach corridor. Through the viewport, I could see the first human relay beacon, its running light blinking steady green against the dark. Green meant all systems functioning. Green meant the route was clear. Green meant you are in the right place. I had not seen that light in 11 months. The last posting had run long, as they always did. I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes. Somewhere far behind me, in a great curved chamber full of arguing voices, 812 species were beginning to understand something that humanity had understood for a while now. That power is not what you are given. It is what you build while no one is watching. We had been building for a very long time. The first call from Archon Veldros came 6 hours after I landed at Heathrow. I was in my kitchen. Caroline was making tea. Our daughter Lily, who was 14 and had strong opinions about everything, was sitting at the table doing her homework and loudly explaining why her history teacher was wrong about the first contact period. I had my shoes off. I had a cup of tea in my hand that I had not yet had a chance to drink. The communicator on the counter buzzed, and the display read, Galactic Council, Priority Diplomatic Channel, Archon Veldros. Don't answer it, Lily said, without looking up from her homework. Lily, Caroline said. He just got home. He did, I agreed. But I should answer it. I picked up the communicator and stepped into the hallway. Ambassador Marin. You are no longer an ambassador, Veldros said. His voice through the translator was tight, controlled, but tight in a way I had not heard before. That is technically true, I said. You're right. I'm just Kale then. Silence. Veldros did not handle informality well. The council requires an explanation. The withdrawal document contains a full statement of reasons, I said. 43 pages. I drafted it myself. I thought it was fairly thorough. 43 pages of administrative language that says very little. It says that humanity is withdrawing from the Galactic Council as permitted under Article 44, subsection 9, and that we thank the Council for the years of association. I paused. I thought it was polite. Kale. He used my first name. That was new. This is not how civilized species behave. I thought about 6 years in the observation tier. I thought about Claire Hobbs and 19 years, and a ratification that came 8 months too late. I kept my voice easy. We followed every procedure correctly. We filed every form in the right place at the right time. We gave 3 years of notice, which is twice the minimum required. I think that is quite civilized. The council cannot function with... He stopped. Started again. Your administrative software, the navigation tools, the arbitration systems, We need to discuss transition arrangements. There it was. I had wondered how long that would take. 6 hours was faster than I expected. The Council's Economic Advisory Committee was apparently more awake than their administrative archive. Of course, I said. Our commercial contractors will be happy to discuss ongoing service agreements. You should contact them directly. Their rates are very reasonable, and their terms are straightforward. Another silence. Longer this time. You are saying the Council must negotiate with private companies. The Council has always contracted with private companies for technical services, I said. This is not new. The nature of those contracts may change somewhat, now that human representatives are not present in the chamber to facilitate discussions. But the companies are professional, and the work is good. You will not have any problems. This is a negotiating position, he said. You want something from this. Tell me what it is. I looked back at the kitchen. Through the doorway, I could see Caroline pouring tea. Lily had given up on her homework and was watching the hallway with undisguised curiosity. I want to finish my tea before it gets cold, I said. Beyond that, Archon, I genuinely have no demands. The withdrawal is complete. There is no negotiation. He did not say anything for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different. The control was still there, but underneath it was something I had not heard from Veldros in 11 years. Something that sounded like uncertainty. You understand what you have done. Yes, I said. The Council has been the foundation of galactic order for 8 centuries. It has been the most powerful institution in the galaxy for 8 centuries, I said. Those are not always the same thing. I ended the call before he could respond. I was aware that this was not traditionally diplomatic behavior. I found, somewhat to my surprise, that I did not mind. I walked back into the kitchen. Caroline handed me my tea. It was still warm. Lily was looking at me with an expression that combined deep fascination with the specific hunger of a 14-year-old who has questions, and has decided that now is the right time for all of them. Was that the Archon? She asked. Yes. What did he want? He wanted to understand what had happened. She thought about this. What did you tell him? Nothing useful, I said. She grinned. She had Caroline's eyes and my stubbornness, a combination that I found equal parts exhausting and wonderful. Good, she said. I sat down at the table and drank my tea and listened to her explain, at great length, exactly why her history teacher was wrong. Outside the kitchen window, the London evening was doing what London evenings did, which was to look gray and full of light at the same time, the sky holding on to color longer than you expected. The communicator on the counter buzzed again, then 3 times in rapid succession. I did not look at it. The second wave of contact came the next morning, and it was more organized than the first. 3 separate diplomatic teams arrived at the British Foreign Office within an hour of each other, all requesting meetings with the former human ambassador to the Galactic Council. The Varathi team was largest, 7 members, which was unusual. Varathi diplomacy traditionally ran in pairs. The Rendaki sent 1 delegate, which was also unusual, because the Rendaki usually sent nobody and issued statements instead. The Olden sent Orin himself, which was not unusual, because Orin and I were friends, but the fact that he had come in person rather than sending a message suggested he was worried about what I would do with a written record of what he wanted to say. I met with Orin first. He was one of very few beings in the galaxy whose company I actively sought, and his presence at the Foreign Office before 9 in the morning told me the situation inside the Council was worse than even I had anticipated. He sat across from me in one of the smaller meeting rooms, with his hands flat on the table, in the olden gesture of sincerity, and he looked at me for a long moment before he said anything. 3 species have requested membership reviews, he said. I had not expected that quite so quickly. Which 3? The Velshan, the Pek Moran, and the Dathine Collective. I absorbed this. The Velshan were a mid-sized species who had been council members for about a century, and had spent most of that century being talked over in committee. The Pek Moran were newer, smaller, and had been in the observation tier for 4 years, the same position we had once occupied. The Dathine Collective was a surprise. They had been members for 200 years. The Dathine, I said. Orin nodded. They were watching when you handed in the withdrawal notice. Apparently several of their senior delegates spent the night reviewing the charter. Article 44, Subsection 9. Subsection 9, he confirmed. He studied me. Kale, did you know this would happen? I thought about how to answer that honestly. I knew it was possible, I said. I didn't engineer it. There's a difference? A significant one, I said. I filed a legal document through the correct channel. What other species do with that information is their own decision. Oren was quiet for a moment. He was a careful thinker, which I had always appreciated. He did not react to things, he considered them. The Archon held an emergency session this morning, he said. There was a vote on whether to invalidate the withdrawal on procedural grounds. On what grounds? They are still working that out. That is not how grounds work, I said. No, he agreed. It was not a rational vote. It was a frightened one. He paused. It failed, incidentally. 22 species voted against invalidation, enough to block it. I had not known that. Something moved in my chest, not quite satisfaction, because the situation was too large and too uncertain for something as simple as satisfaction, but something adjacent to it. 22, I said. More than I expected, Oren said. Some of them said it openly, that if the Charter allows withdrawal, the Charter allows withdrawal, and that the Council cannot simply choose which of its own rules to enforce. He looked at me steadily. Some of them were thinking about their own options. We sat with that for a moment. What does the Council want from me? I asked, though I was fairly certain I already knew. To come back, Oren said simply. Veldros believes that if you return, the other withdrawals can be prevented, that the situation can be reset. It cannot be reset, I said, not because I am refusing to cooperate, but because the information is already out. Other species know the Charter allows withdrawal. That is not something that can be unlearned. I know that, Oren said. Veldros does not fully believe it yet. I looked at my old friend across the table. He was tired. I had known him for 11 years, and I had never seen him tired before. The Olden did not tire easily. They were methodical, steady, built for long processes. His tiredness was not physical. It was the tiredness of someone who has been inside an institution for a very long time, and has just begun, for the first time, to truly see its edges. What do you want, Oren? I asked. He looked at his hands on the table for a moment. Then he looked at me. I want to understand what comes next, he said. Not what the Council wants, not what Veldros wants, what actually comes next. I thought about the file in my briefcase. The one with 43,000 unmapped systems and hundreds of fringe relationships, and the names of 60 Edinburgh software engineers, whose navigation tools ran on 60% of Council shipping. I thought about the proposal that Earth's policy teams had been drafting for 2 years, quietly, without any announcement, waiting for the right moment. Something different, I said. Not a replacement, something different. He waited. The Council is built on the assumption that governance requires a center, I said. A single chamber, a vote, a hierarchy of authority. Older species at the top, newer species working their way up, everyone moving through the same system at the same pace on the same terms. I paused. That model made sense when it was built. I am not sure it makes sense anymore. What would you replace it with? Nothing that tries to be the Council, I said. Something smaller in structure and larger in reach. Open membership. No tiers. No observation periods. Decisions made by direct agreement between parties, rather than by majority vote in a centralized chamber. I looked at him. Not governance. Cooperation. Oren was quiet for a long time. The older species will never accept it, he said. The Varathi built the Council. It is how they understand their place in the galaxy. They don't have to accept it, I said. They can keep the Council running exactly as it is, if they choose. I am not asking them to dismantle anything. I paused. But the other species, the newer ones, the fringe ones, the ones who were never asked to join, and the ones who were asked and said no, they might find it useful. Oren looked at me with his wide, pale eyes for a long moment. I could see him working through the implications, step by careful step, the way the Olden always did. You have been planning this for a very long time, he said. I have been thinking about it for a very long time, I said. That is not quite the same thing. He nodded slowly. Then he stood. because he had other meetings, and because this conversation had reached the point where more words would not add more understanding. At the door, he turned back. "The Dathine," he said. "Why do you think they moved so quickly?" I thought about it. The Dathine Collective had 200 years of council membership. They were established, respected, and widely considered to be among the most stable presences in the chamber. There was no obvious reason for them to risk that stability by filing a membership review 24 hours after a human walked out with a box of belongings. "Ask them," I said. "I suspect they'll tell you." He left. I sat in the small meeting room alone for a moment, with the gray London light coming through the window, and the communicator on the table buzzing steadily, and the sound of Foreign Office staff moving in the corridor outside. The Vorathi team was waiting. The Rendaki delegate was waiting. And in a chamber 8,000 light-years away, an Archon who had held his seat for 60 years was facing a room full of species that were, for the first time in a very long time, thinking about something other than the view from inside. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and went to meet the next part of what was happening. There is a particular kind of silence that I had learned to identify during my 11 years with the Council. It was not the silence of agreement, or of boredom, or of the careful diplomatic pause that experienced delegates used before delivering a difficult statement. It was the silence of an institution that did not know what to do next. I heard that silence, secondhand, in every communication that came out of the council chamber over the next 3 weeks. I was not present for any of it. I was home. I ate breakfast with Lily, and helped Caroline review structural calculations for a new habitat project in the Ceres Belt, and I went for walks in the park near our house, in the early mornings, when the city was quiet. I read, I slept. I had not slept properly in 11 months, and my body spent the first week of my return simply insisting on 8 hours of it regardless of what my mind wanted to do. The communications I was still receiving came through my former office at the Foreign Office, where a young aide named Peter Graves was sorting them into categories. Peter was 23 years old and terrifyingly organized. He had worked for me for 2 years and had developed a system for the communications which he summarized in a daily brief that arrived on my communicator at 7 in the morning. The brief for the third day home had 3 categories: diplomatic, 47 messages, mostly from council species requesting information or meetings; commercial, 22 messages, from the human software and navigation companies whose contracts the council was now urgently trying to renegotiate; and what Peter had labeled, with admirable precision, other significant developments. The significant developments for Day 3 were: the Velshan delegation formally submitted their membership review paperwork, the Pek Moran withdrew their review after apparent pressure from the Vorathi Diplomatic Corps, and the Dathine Collective held a public press conference, not inside the council, in actual open media space that any species could access, in which their senior delegate said, and I read this 3 times to make sure I had it right, that the Galactic Council had been operating as a mechanism for protecting the power of its oldest members, rather than serving the interests of the galaxy at large, and that the Dathine were consulting their people about next steps. That press conference was significant for many reasons, but the most significant was this: it was public. The Dathine had not sent a private diplomatic communication. They had not filed a document through an administrative portal. They had stood in front of cameras and said, directly and without qualification, something that had been true for a very long time, and that everyone inside the council already knew, but that the council's culture of formal process had made almost impossible to say out loud. Peter's brief noted that Archon Veldros had issued an immediate response calling the Dathine statement unhelpful and contrary to the spirit of council membership. Peter had highlighted this with a small note in the margin. He said spirit, not procedure. First time he hasn't cited procedure. Peter was going to be very good at his job. On the 5th day, Veldros sent a personal message. Not through the diplomatic channel this time. Personal code, the same kind Oren had used. The message was longer than I expected. He was not a man who used many words, and this message used quite a few. He described the situation inside the council in detail. 3 additional species had requested informal consultations about membership status. The software maintenance schedule for the administrative systems had been disrupted because human contractors were now requiring renegotiated contracts before beginning the quarterly update cycle. and the Council's internal IT division did not fully understand the architecture of systems they had been contracting out for 20 years. The border arbitration algorithm had flagged 4 new disputes that would require direct Council intervention, because the automated resolution process had stalled during a routine update. He described all of this in measured, careful language, and then he wrote something that I read twice, because I wanted to make sure I had understood it correctly. He wrote, "I am not writing to ask you to return. I understand that this is not something you will do. I am writing because I have been Archon of this council for 60 years, and in that time I have never needed to ask whether the council's way of doing things was the right way. I find that I am now asking this. I thought you should know." I sat with that message for a long time. Then I called Caroline in from the garden and read it to her. She listened with her arms crossed and the expression she wore when she was calculating load tolerances. "He sounds lonely," she said. "He sounds frightened," I said. "Both," she said. She went back to the garden. Lily had been listening from the hallway. When I looked up, she was leaning against the doorframe with the carefully casual posture of someone who had been eavesdropping, but was not going to admit it. "The Archon is scared?" she asked. "I think so," I said. She thought about this. Lily thought about things the way Caroline did, quietly, from multiple angles, without rushing to the first available conclusion. "Is that good?" she asked. I thought about Claire Hobbs, about 19 years and a pending stamp and a ratification that came 8 months too late, about the 300,000 people in the outer belt colonies who had lived in temporary habitats long past the point when anything about their situation was temporary, about all the species, the Velshan and the Peck Moran, and the Dathan, and the hundreds of fringe worlds that never even got to the point of applying, who had spent their own years learning what it meant to wait for a table that had been set by someone else. "I don't want him to suffer," I said honestly. "Veldros is not a bad person. He is a person who was given enormous authority very early, and spent 60 years inside a system that told him the system was right." I paused. "But I think it is good that he is asking the question. I think it is overdue." Lily nodded slowly. She came and sat at the table across from me, in the same chair Oren had occupied in the Foreign Office meeting room, and looked at me with her mother's eyes. "What happens now?" she asked. "To the council." "They will adapt," I said, "or they won't. That is genuinely their choice. But the other species, the ones filing reviews, they will make their own choices," I said. "We are not pulling anyone out. We are not pushing anyone. We simply left, and in leaving we showed that leaving was possible. What any other species does with that information is entirely up to them." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that enough? Just showing them it was possible?" It was a good question. It was the question I had been living with for 11 years, honestly. Not whether withdrawal was possible, that had always been in the charter, but whether a demonstration of possibility was sufficient to change anything real, or whether it was simply a gesture. "I don't know yet," I said. "Ask me in a year." She accepted this in the way she accepted most things I said when I was being genuinely uncertain rather than evasive, with a small nod and the expression that meant she was filing it away to revisit later. Then she went back to her homework. Peter's brief for the 10th day contained a category that had not appeared in previous briefs. He labeled it, with his characteristic precision, "Unexpected Development." The unexpected development was a request for a meeting from 3 fringe species delegates, beings who held no council membership, no formal status, no diplomatic credentials in any system the council would recognize. They were not writing through any official channel, because they had no access to official channels. They were writing through the commercial contact portal of a trading company based in Aberdeen, which was operated by a man named Duncan Harlow, who had been running independent trade missions to the outer systems for 15 years. Duncan had forwarded the message with a note that said, "These folks say they've heard about what you did, and they'd like to talk. I told them you're a busy man. They said they'd wait." I thought about that. 3 species, no credentials, writing through a trading company's contact portal because they did not have access to anything else. I wrote back, "Tell them I am not that busy." The meeting was held 2 weeks later, in a conference room at the Aberdeen spaceport, which was a practical choice, because Duncan's facilities were there, and because the 3 delegates had arranged their own transport, and that was where they landed. There was nothing official about the meeting. No protocol. No translator beads from the Council's systems. They used their own, small personal units that produced a slightly different quality of sound. No recording equipment except what each of us brought ourselves. There were 7 of them in total. 3 from the Hirani, who occupied a cluster of worlds in the deep outer arm that no council charter included. 2 from the Osid, a species I had only encountered in Duncan's trade reports. And 2 from a species that did not have a name in Galactic Standard because they had never been formally catalogued by any council survey and referred to themselves by a word that translated loosely as the people who come from the warm place. They sat across from me and looked at me with the particular attention of beings who have traveled a long way for something they cannot get anywhere else. The Hirani delegate, a compact being with dark brown skin covered in fine geometric patterns that shifted slightly with her breathing, spoke first. Her translator unit gave her voice a warm, slightly delayed quality. "We have known about the council for many years," she said. "We have watched it from outside. We did not think it was something we could ever be part of, because the entrance requirements were built for species that were already powerful, and we are not powerful in the ways they measure." "I know," I said. "We heard about what you did," she continued. "Not because of any official announcement, because Duncan told us, and because we talked to people who talk to people." She paused. "We are not interested in the council. We have never been interested in the council. But we heard that humanity was thinking about something different, and we are interested in that." I looked around the table at 7 beings from 3 species that the council did not officially know existed. I thought about the proposal that Earth's policy teams had been drafting for 2 years. I thought about what I had said to Oren in the Foreign Office meeting room. Not governance. Cooperation. "We are still working it out," I said honestly. "It does not have a name yet. It is not ready to be announced. But the shape of it is an open framework. No tiers. No waiting periods. Any species can sign. Any species can leave. Decisions made by direct agreement rather than by central vote." The Hirani delegate looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "That sounds like how we already do things among ourselves." "Yes," I said. "I thought it might." Duncan made tea. The Aberdeen spaceport hummed around us. And in that conference room, with no cameras and no protocol and no official record being kept by anyone except the 7 of us and a man with a teapot, something began that did not yet have a name, but that already had more participants than the council had accumulated in its first 20 years. I did not tell Peter about it. Not yet. Some things needed time to grow before they needed to be documented. But I went home that evening, and I told Caroline, because I always told Caroline everything eventually, and because she had a way of measuring the structural integrity of ideas that I trusted more than almost anything else. She listened. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How many species?" "3 so far," I said. "In that room. But Hirani trade networks reach 17 systems, and the Osid have been in contact with at least 8 groups who are in similar positions." She did the arithmetic the way she always did, quickly and without a calculator. "That's potentially 25 or 30 species," she said, "without anyone even trying yet." "Without anyone even trying yet," I agreed. She picked up her tea. She looked at me across the kitchen table with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether a load-bearing structure would hold. "Kale," she said, "do you actually know what you're building?" "Not precisely," I said. She nodded. "Good," she said. "The things you know precisely in advance never turn out to be the things that matter." I thought about that for a long time after she went to bed. I was still thinking about it when the city outside went quiet, and the communicator on the counter stopped buzzing for the first time in weeks. The council was still there. 812 species, 8 centuries of history, the most powerful institution the galaxy had ever produced. I did not wish it harm. I did not want it to collapse. I wanted it to look up from its own procedures long enough to see what was happening around it, to understand that power is not a seat at a table, and that the galaxy had more going on in it than any single chamber could ever contain. But I could not make it understand. I could only make choices, and show that choices were possible, and trust that other beings, other species with their own histories and their own waiting, and their own quiet years of building while someone else was deliberating, would make choices of their own. I turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. In the morning, I would call Peter and tell him to arrange a meeting with Earth's policy team. It was time to give the thing we were building a name. The name we chose was simple, which was intentional. We had spent a great deal of time with names that were grand and formal and built to sound important, and we had watched how those names became walls over time, barriers that told you what something was supposed to be before you had a chance to discover what it actually was. We called it the Compact of Mutual Passage. Compact because it was an agreement between equals, not a declaration by an authority. Mutual because everything in it ran both ways. Passage because the core of it was not governance or law or enforcement. It was the right to move, to trade, to communicate, to cross the space between stars without asking permission from a body that had decided who was important enough to be heard. The drafting team was 8 people, working out of a building in Edinburgh that had previously been used for a software company before that company's main contracts had grown large enough to require more space. The building still smelled faintly of old coffee and warm electronics, which I found appropriate. The 8 people were a mix of policy specialists, legal theorists, trade economists, and one linguist named Vera Holland whose specific job was to make sure that every sentence in the document could be understood by a being who had never read a Galactic Council charter. Vera's working principle was that if she could not explain a clause to her 10-year-old nephew in less than 2 sentences, the clause needed to be rewritten. The compact had 47 clauses when it was finished. Every single one of them passed the 2-sentence test. I was not the most important person in that room. I want to be clear about that. I was the former ambassador, which gave me certain kinds of access and a certain kind of credibility, but the actual intellectual work of building the compact was done by people who were considerably better at the specific tasks involved than I was. Owen Lark, who led the trade economics team, had spent 12 years mapping the commercial relationships between fringe species and had a mind that processed interconnected systems the way other minds processed simple addition. Nina Foss, the chief legal theorist, had written 2 books on non-hierarchical governance structures that I had read during long council sessions when the debates became too circular to follow productively. The 8 of them together built something I could not have built alone, and I was glad of it. I contributed the things I could contribute. The relationships I had built over 11 years, the knowledge of how the council worked and where its edges were, and the specific kind of patience that comes from spending a long time inside an institution that does not change easily, and learning to work around it without being destroyed by frustration. And I contributed, on the 11th day of drafting, a piece of information that changed the shape of the document significantly. The information came from Duncan Harlow, who had followed up the Aberdeen meeting with a series of conversations across his trade network. Duncan was not a diplomat. He was a man who had been going to difficult places for 15 years because he found it interesting and because the commercial opportunities were real, and he had developed over that time an extraordinary range of contacts and a reputation for straightforwardness that opened doors that official channels could not reach. He called me on a Tuesday evening and said, "Cale, there's something you should know. The Harani delegate you met in Aberdeen, her name is Sevi, by the way. I should have introduced you properly. She's been talking to people. A lot of people. Faster than I expected." "How fast?" I asked. "The OSID trade network runs to 41 systems," he said. "The Harani trade network runs to 23. There's an overlap of about 15. Between them, they've been in contact with representatives from 68 species in the past 2 weeks." I put down what I was holding. 68. 68 that are interested enough to have responded, he said. There are more that haven't responded yet. Sevi says the communication is still going out. I thought about the compact sitting on the Edinburgh team's screens, carefully drafted for a framework that we had imagined would begin with perhaps 20 or 30 participants. "Duncan," I said, "can you get me a meeting with Sevi again? And with as many of the 68 as can be there?" "Where and when?" he said. "Wherever makes sense for her," I said. "Not Earth. Somewhere neutral." He came back to me the next morning with coordinates I did not recognize and a date 3 weeks out, and I sent them to Nina Foss, who looked at them on the map and said, with her characteristic lack of expression, "That's in the deep outer arm. No council jurisdiction. Good choice." We took 3 ships, not military, a research vessel, a commercial transport, and a diplomatic shuttle that the Foreign Office lent us without asking too many questions. partly because the Foreign Office had been following developments with quiet interest, and partly because the Foreign Secretary was a woman named Helen Marsh, who had known Claire Hobbs personally and had her own feelings about the Council that she expressed rarely and precisely. The meeting place was a space station that the Harani had been running for 30 years as a trade hub, which meant it was built for the practical needs of many different species, rather than the formal requirements of any specific one. It was not impressive in the architectural sense. It was functional and welcoming, and full of the particular organized energy of a place where serious commercial business gets done by people who have learned to work together across significant differences. There were representatives from 44 species present, not all 68. The distance was too great for some, and others were still uncertain. But 44, in person, in a room that smelled of a dozen different atmospheres and was lit to accommodate at least 6 different species' visual requirements. I had been in the council chamber hundreds of times. I had sat in rooms with more species than this. But this room felt different in a way that I spent the shuttle journey home trying to articulate to Peter, who was with me and taking notes. It felt like a conversation, I said, not a procedure. Peter, who was excellent at his job, and had the additional quality of knowing when to write things down and when to simply listen, put down his pen. "Was that enough?" he asked. "To build something on?" "I think so," I said. "The Harani trade network is a real thing. The relationships these species have with each other are real things. We are not asking them to build something from nothing. We are asking if they want to give a name to something that already exists." He nodded. He picked up his pen again. "The council will find out about the meeting," he said, "if they haven't already." "They have already," I said. "Veldros sent me a message this morning." Peter looked up. "What did he say?" I thought about the message. It had been shorter than his previous ones, just 2 paragraphs. The first had asked, very formally, whether the meeting at the Harani station constituted an attempt to form an alternative governance structure to the council. The second had said, much less formally, "KL, what are you building out there?" It was the same question Lily had asked, the same question Caroline had asked, the same question I had been sitting with myself. "He asked what we were building," I said. "What did you tell him?" I looked out the viewport at the stars, which were doing what stars do, which is to say they were there, and they were vast, and they were not particularly concerned with any of the things happening among the small, busy, arguing beings traveling between them. I told him I would let him know when it had a name, I said. Peter wrote that down. The Compact of Mutual Passage was formally opened for signatures 14 weeks after the Aberdeen meeting. Not announced through the Council's channels. Announced through every fringe trade network and independent communication system that Duncan and Sevi and their combined contacts could reach, which was, as it turned out, considerable. The first 40 signatures came in within a week. 37 of them were from species that the Council did not have on official record. By the end of the second month, the number was 91. I was not at the signing ceremony. There was no single signing ceremony. That was the point. The compact did not require a grand occasion, a central location, a moment of formal recognition from any existing authority. Any species could sign through a secure digital protocol from wherever they were, at whatever point they decided they were ready. Some species sent representatives to sign together in groups. Some signed alone. Some signed immediately. Some took weeks to read the 47 clauses and consult their people and ask questions through the open communication channel that Owen's team maintained for exactly that purpose. On the 61st day, I was in the kitchen eating lunch when Peter called. "The Velshan have signed," he said. The Velshan had been council members for a century. Their membership review had been filed, then put on hold while they considered their options. Now they had made their decision. "Any response from the council?" I asked. "Not yet," he said. "The Rendaki have called an emergency session. The Dathine have issued a statement saying they support the compact and are continuing to consider their own position. And," he paused, "there's a request from Archon Veldros. Not diplomatic channel, personal. What does he want? He wants to meet. In person. On Earth. If you're willing." I looked at the plant on the kitchen windowsill, which had grown 2 more leaves since I'd brought it home. 11 years with me. And it had never stopped growing. "Tell him yes," I said. "Tell him to come to London. We will have tea." He arrived on a Thursday morning, which was an unremarkable choice, and therefore probably an intentional one. Veldros was precise about things like that. He came with a smaller team than I expected. 4 staff, no ceremonial guards, no announcement through official channels. He arrived at Heathrow on a vessel that landed in the commercial terminal, not the diplomatic one. I met him at the house, not the Foreign Office, the house, which was another intentional choice on my part. He stood in my kitchen, 4 fingers spread flat on the counter in a gesture that my translator told me indicated a request for direct conversation, and he looked at the plant on the windowsill for a long moment before he looked at me. "That was in the council chamber," he said. "Yes," I said. "I brought it with me when I left." He was quiet. He looked older than I remembered, which might have been a trick of the different light, or might have been 60 days of the most significant institutional crisis of his 60-year tenure. I made tea. He accepted a cup and held it with both hands in the Vorathi way, warming his palms. 91 species, he said. 93, as of this morning, I said. 2 more signed overnight. He absorbed this. Most of them are not council members. No, I said. Most of them are not. That is rather the point. He turned the cup in his hands. Kale, I have been Archon of the Council for 60 years. In that time, I have believed, genuinely believed, that the Council was the best available structure for galactic order. Not perfect. I know it is not perfect, but better than the alternatives. I know you believe that, I said. I still believe it, he said. But I am also aware. He stopped. He put the cup down. He looked at me directly, with the unblinking Vorathi gaze that I had learned to read as its own kind of precision. I am aware that 93 species signed a document without coming to us first, without asking for our approval, without filing anything through our systems. And I am aware that this was not an act of aggression. It was simply an act that did not require us. That was the most honest thing I had ever heard Veldros say. No, I said quietly. It did not require you. He was still for a moment. Will you tell me what you actually want from this? Not the policy language, not the formal position. What do you actually want? I thought about Claire Hobbs, about 6 years in the observation tier, about the colonies in the outer belt and the species in the deep outer arm that had never been asked anything by anyone, about Lily's question, what happens now? I want the galaxy to work better for the species that were never included in the design of it, I said. I want beings who have been waiting for permission to simply have passage, movement, the ability to connect with each other and trade and talk and exist in the galaxy without needing to navigate a system that was built by someone else, for someone else, 8 centuries ago. I paused. I do not want to destroy the Council. I do not want to take anything from you. I want there to be more options than there were before. Veldros looked at me for a very long time. Then he said, the Council will not join the compact. I know, I said. We did not ask them to. But we may. He stopped. Started again. There are elements within the Council's membership who are discussing whether the Council's own charter might be amended to address some of the structural concerns, the tier system, the processing delays, the concentration of administrative authority. He paused. I am not announcing this. I am telling you privately, because you should know. Something moved in me that was warm and complicated. That would be good, I said carefully, for the species that remain in the Council. Yes, he said. He picked up his tea again. He drank it in silence for a moment. Then he said, with the particular directness that I had always respected in him, even when I disagreed with everything around it, you humiliated us, Kale. You should know that we feel that. I know, I said. That was not my intention, but I understand why it felt that way. Is there anything you would have done differently? I thought about that honestly. I would have said goodbye to Oren in person, I said, instead of just sending a message. He almost smiled. I was not certain. The Vorathi expression was subtle, but I thought he almost did. He left after an hour. No announcements, no press. He walked out to the car that was waiting and was gone, and London went on being London around the empty street. I went back inside. Lily was home from school, sitting at the kitchen table, and she looked up when I came in. Was that really the Archon, she asked. She had watched from upstairs through the window. Yes, I said. What did you talk about? I sat down across from her. He wanted to understand what we were building. What did you tell him? I looked at the plant on the windowsill. It was doing well, the same as it always had, growing steadily in whatever light was available, and not particularly concerned with the politics of the beings moving around it. I told him the truth, I said. She waited. I told him that we had not set out to build an empire. We were not interested in ruling anything. We had simply spent a very long time inside a room that did not have enough space for us, and we had stepped outside, and the outside was bigger than most species had been allowed to discover. And now we were sharing the map. Lily was quiet for a moment. She had her mother's eyes, and her mother's way of measuring things before she spoke. That's good, she said. The map thing. Thank you, I said. She went back to her homework. I made more tea. The communicator on the counter buzzed, Peter, with the daily brief. I would read it in a few minutes. There would be new signatures probably. There would be messages from Owen and Nina about the next phase of the compact's implementation. There would be something from Duncan about a new contact in a system whose name I probably couldn't pronounce yet. All of it could wait for 5 minutes. I stood at the kitchen window with my tea and looked at the plant, which had come from the council chamber to my kitchen, without any fuss, and had continued to grow regardless of where it was, because that is what living things do when they are given enough light and enough space. We had not wanted the galaxy to bow to us. We had never wanted that. We had wanted it to wonder, just once, if it could do better than what had been handed to it by history. We had wanted it to look at the frame around the picture and ask whether the frame was the same as the painting. And now, 93 species, 94 by the time I finished my tea, as it turned out, because Peter's message arrived while I was standing there, and it said, 2 more signed. One of them is the Dathine Collective. Full withdrawal from the council, effective immediately. 94 species were asking. Not all of them would agree with each other. Not all of them would find the compact easy or smooth or always beneficial. That was not the promise we had made. The compact was not a promise of perfection. It was a promise of passage, of the right to try, to move, to connect, without waiting for permission from a body that had decided you were not important enough to be heard. That was enough to start with. The communicator buzzed again. Owen, this time, with a question about the implementation timeline. I finished my tea and went to answer it. Outside the window, a London evening was happening, gray and full of light, holding on to color longer than you expected. Somewhere 8,000 light-years away, in a curved chamber that was a little emptier than it used to be, someone was looking at a chair that had not been collected, sitting in the space where it had always been, and deciding what it meant. I hoped they would figure it out. I had faith, in the slow and careful way that 11 years of watching difficult institutions had taught me to have faith, that they would get there. In the meantime, there was work to do. There always was. That was the other thing about humanity that people sometimes forgot to mention. Alongside the impatience and the restlessness, the work. The quiet, steady, unremarkable, extraordinary work. We had never stopped doing it. We were not going to stop now.